So there is an existing literature on the smart grid that looks at the issue from different disciplinary perspectives, economics, innovation studies, and so on. But they tend to be policy focused rather than politics focused. Although Catherine's work is an exception. The other important thing about these studies is that they all predate a key review of the regulatory framework in the UK and the introduction of a new regulatory framework following 2010. So that's partly what I'm looking at, what's happened since this literature emerged. Very briefly on the smart grid concept. This is a politics conference, not on an energy technology one, but it's quite useful to know what this is about. First, it's very important to say this is about not the high voltage, big pylons, kind of part of the electricity grid, but the low voltage, local, largely local, distribution networks, low voltage distribution networks in the UK. So it looks like that rather than big pylons. There are three kind of big reasons why changing the way that networks will operate and what they consist of will be very important for a low carbon transition. One is that as we start to get more and more renewable generation, things like solar PV panels, directly onto distribution networks, they start generating electricity on the network. Networks traditionally have been used for taking power from large centralized power stations to users, but this is about having electricity generated on distribution networks. Another reason why they're important is that as we get more and more variable renewables like wind power, traditionally we've balanced the electricity system reflexing supply, but increasingly we're going to have to change that and get balanced reflexing demand, and that's going to require huge innovation in things like smart meters and appliances, and the network has to change to deal with all that. The last point is about the electrification of heat and transport. It's widely expected that with electric vehicles and with heat pumps there's going to be a lot more electrical demand on the system, and unless there are smarter solutions to this, it's going to cost an enormous amount of money to reinforce and build systems that can cope with that. So there are real reasons why smart grids matter for low carbon technology. It means major technological and innovation, operational innovation, and it also means that the role of the companies who currently operate those systems has to change fundamentally from being just network operators to being system operators, to balance the system and use active network management to do that. Now all of this means that there's not only a technological challenge but also a major governance challenge, and this is widely recognised really, that we will need wide changes in the governance of these companies. Since 1998, following privatisation in the UK, networks have been run by privately owned monopolies which are regulated by the electricity regulator, who in the UK is currently called Ofgem, and there's 14 of these companies in Great Britain. Now, since privatisation, these companies have been regulated under a form of revenue cap regulation known as RPI minus X. And don't go into the details, but basically their revenue is capped through a process of negotiation. It's then adjusted to take account of inflation over the period, which has been 5 years, to allow them to take account of inflation, but then reduced again by an efficiency factor called X to bear down on them and make them realise cost savings. And it's widely seen as having produced good efficiency, low costs, considerably lower costs than in some other countries, but not innovation. There's a nice quote here from a senior Ofgem person saying, look, these networks haven't really changed in 50 years. So that's the challenge, if you like, in a way. Now, I want to show you this diagram. It's quite complicated, but it's basically a timeline of what's been happening in electricity distribution networks since 2000. But I want you to focus on the two areas that are covered in red. This is an important part of the context. Since the early 2000s, and especially in the latter part of the last decade, the political context for Ofgem, for networks, changed quite a lot. You had the campaign for the climate change bill, big increase in awareness about and concern about climate change in the UK. You had the introduction of the Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Committee, the Stern Review, and there were a series of, and a very critical report in 2007 of Ofgem by the Sustainable Development Commission. So the political context really was beginning to put quite a lot of pressure on Ofgem. And what that led to, at the top, you can see a whole series of instances at which Ofgem's role and duties were changed by the government. in a way that was basically trying to get it to take more attention, give more attention to climate change and to the low carbon imperative. Saying you're not doing enough, you've got to focus more on this. And at the same time, there were various working groups set up to look at things like distributed generation. There were various strategy groups set up trying to ask how could you do this in practice. At the same time, we had a series of what are called price control reviews. This is the way that the regulation is done. Every 5 years, there's a price control review. Often sets the revenue, and then that runs for 5 years. Distribution Price Control Review 4 started in 2005, and we're currently in DPCR 5. So this was sort of what was going on over the 2000s. There was considerable pressure on Ofgem to try to change the regulation in ways which gave more attention to the low carbon imperative. But in fact, relatively little happened. There's a nice quote actually from Catherine's book that says, although this issue has been looked at in detail since 2000, there has been very little actual change in the design and operation of networks. So there's a lot of talk about how networks needed to change, but very little actual change. And this is really partly because there have been only marginal changes in the regulation of networks. And looking at the literature, which I mentioned before, at the end of the 2000s, I think you can see sort of 5 unresolved issues, and I'll go through them very quickly. One is about how what's the governance of rules for connecting and managing distributed generation. There were incentives, but they weren't effective, and there was a piecemeal and strategic approach, and there was a call for a much more effective approach. R&D on research and development on networks. It's network companies won't spend money on R&D unless they're incentivized to do so by the regulator. And what Ofgem started to do then was to set up funds specifically to make R&D possible. And they started growing in scale, actually. Most recently, it's quite large scale. But the point is, I guess, and what critics were saying was that innovation isn't incorporated into the underlying regulatory framework, and the lessons from these R&D funds aren't necessarily going to be taken up across in network operation and investment in a mainstream way. The third issue is the bias towards capital spend. You find this across regulated infrastructure companies across the world. In the case of the UK, there was a sort of very complex incentive scheme to try to balance this, but in reality, the approach in the industry is basically what's often called fit and forget. If you're worried about whether something works, just spend a lot of money on the capital investment and go away for 25 years, and that's the approach in the industry. And of course, that doesn't go well with a smarter approach, where you're looking at maybe contracts with a distributed generator or a demand-side response contract instead of building more assets. It emerged that there's got a great deal of uncertainty about future network needs. And Ofgem has always taken the view with companies that what they should do is demonstrate need before they make the investment. Otherwise, they, as a company, are taking a risk because they're not necessarily going to have the investment approved as what Ofgem considers efficient investment. And the idea of anticipating and making strategic investments hasn't been there, it wasn't there in existing regulation. And the final point was that, which relates to this point about the changing role of DNOs, which is the idea that they should become much more active, proactive, managing the network, managing flows of power in the network. To do that effectively, they would have to have access to or ownership of things like generation and storage. And at the moment, by legislation, they aren't allowed to do that. They can only own networks. They're completely separated from other parts of the industry. Thanks. Some are owned by supply generators, but there's supposed to be no connection between them. There isn't really any way of introducing competition on networks at the moment. So this brings us up to the story, if you like, to the late 2000s. There's been this huge political pressure, or very substantial political pressure, as seen by most commentators on Ofgem. Nothing much has changed. So what happens then? And what happens then is, you can see here on the second arrow, which is that Ofgem starts to undertake a series of strategic reviews. These are the ones which are relevant for networks. First of all, a long-term electricity network scenario study, and then, most importantly, in 2008, the end of 2008, it starts its major review of its regulatory framework called RPI-X at 20. It's about 20 years old by this stage. And this is called a root and branch review, fundamental review by the regulator. And in some senses, you can see this as a response to all that political pressure. And then, very importantly, that feeds into a new, what is advertised as a genuinely new regulatory framework, a new name called the RIO, which applies to all parts of Ofgem's business. And applied to electricity distribution, it's called RIO ED1. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the change has been, but that's the really important thing that happened. And they also set up some institutional things, like they set up a Smart Grids Forum to try to do some kind of technical work. Now the question that I want to ask in the last 5 minutes, one of the two questions I want to ask in the last 5 minutes is, first of all, does RIO-ED1 represent genuinely regulatory innovation? So innovation in the form of regulation now, rather than technological innovation. And here I draw on this framework by Julia Black, who takes Peter Hall's distinction between 3 levels of policy change. First order, which is changes in settings of instruments. Second order is changes in those instruments itself, so maybe from RPI and from price cap to return regulation, for example. Or third, really more fundamental policy paradigmatic change. And then I've looked at these 5 areas. I won't get to the details because there's not enough time. But I think the bottom line is that I think if you look at these 5 areas and you look at this new regulatory framework which Ofgem has produced, you can quite clearly see that there are some first order and second order changes, but this is not a new third order regulatory innovation, if you like. And most important, I mean, the way I think you can tell this is that the justification for all these changes in RIO, the new instruments, the new settings, remains that of primarily of short-term efficiency grounds. They're still using the existing paradigm. That leads me to my third question, which is, well, why is this? I mean, it's interesting because as Caroline noted, institutionalist theories tend to often explain big change through critical junctures, big exogenous shocks that change institutions, shake them up. But here you have a kind of institutional exogenous shock in terms of political pressure from outside the regulator and the network companies, but it doesn't lead to major change. It leads to gradual change, if you like. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that although there was a kind of political pressure and rhetorical pressure on Ofgem, actually the policy pressure isn't that big. And the key area in this is the expected growth in low carbon technologies, heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar PV. The plan which Ofgem and the companies are using for the next 8 years is based on scenarios for growth in these technologies which ultimately come from the government and reflect government policies. And in all of these scenarios, there isn't really major growth in these technologies before 2020. So the sort of policy signal from the government is basically, look, this is, don't worry about this the next 5 years at least, because it's still a way off. And that is obviously very different from the political rhetoric. And I think the companies and Ofgem are reading that as a weak policy pressure. The second reason I think is to do with institutional path dependencies, which go back to privatisation. And here I draw on the work of Michael Moran. He tells this nice story about how when electricity regulation was set up, there were 2 forces of work. One was this focus on giving little child on efficiency, which is still there, short-term monetary cost efficiency, which makes it's a marginalist approach. It makes it difficult for people working within this policy paradigm to think about transformational change. It also has helped create a low risk and risk averse industry in network companies, which mainly focus on trying to stabilise their returns. And the last thing they want really is to try to embrace innovation. They're not innovative companies by their nature. They're mainly trying to get low cost of capital by being very stable. Probably most importantly though, which is that along with that, the focus on efficiency, there was a legacy of what Moran calls club government, where things were done by kind of chats behind closed doors. And the way the regulation was set up in the UK in the late 80s was to give, you have a regulator, a person, not a committee, who has a great deal of discretion in the way that they interpret their remit. And Ofgem, and now DEC, realises that this is going on a big review. And you get what some economists call regulatory inertia. It's a very once you have that system, it's very difficult for governments who have new policy objectives to start to bring those to the regulator. And I think that that has been a very important part of the story. And I think that if you look at the RPI minus X review, that has kind of played a key role. Some of the individuals involved in that, I think, saw the need to do something. Ofgem had to respond to this political pressure in some way. The review enabled them to do that, and enabled them to regain the initiative by framing the issues in such a way that we need to change. That's my conclusions. Why is this not? No, is it this one? This is
No,
it's going to sleep. Anyway, my main,
it's the one on the right.
is it the one on the right?
No,
It's not.
it's the
It's
access.
that one.
It doesn't work. Press escape. There.
And then
Escape doesn't work.
but anyway, two things to say just at the end in 0 seconds. What I think is, if you look at the UK, its smart grid is still framed in terms of future, not current needs of the electricity system. And the big contrast there is with countries like Germany and Denmark, where the policy pressure is to deal with this now rather than in 8 to 10 years. And in terms of implications of what, if you wanted to change that, accelerate smart grid development in the UK, I think you have to change two things. One is to have a stronger policy signal from government that these new technologies are going to be scaled up more quickly, and a change in this institutional relationship between government and the regulator. Lots of different ways of doing that, but that fundamentally has to change. I'll stop there.
Very good.